little notification. And there we go. This Hangout on Air is live. So we are broadcasting to the world. Thank you for joining us. A little bit of background. Here at HT2, we're running a MOOC, a massive open online course for 12 months of the year. We're doing this for two reasons. One, because I didn't really fully think it through before I said I'd get involved in this. And two, because we love to do research here at HT2. Most MOOCs tend to be 4 to 6 to 8 weeks. We've ran one that was only 48 hours long. We're running one that's 12 months long. So we love looking at the data that brings us and figuring out what does that tell us? What can we glean from collecting that data? So that's one of the reasons we're running it for 12 months. Yeah, we look at a different tool, technology, platform, idea that we think is either going to be big for the future or should actually be big now. It's just perhaps not that well recognized. We've looked at AI, VR, AR, wearables, proximity beacons. And this month we're looking at space learning. Now, I don't think that fits on the incredibly new pile. I think that fits on the, we should probably already be doing this pile. It's already been around for a while, but I don't want to make any assumptions until we hear from Donald. One of the people out there in the L&D community that's been speaking for years about this, writing about this, and has just, fairly recently created a brilliant product that's just been shortlisted for an award as well. Congratulations, Donald, with Wildfire. I know you're going to touch on that. So, he's not just talking about it, he's actually gone out there and he's done it and he's doing it and he's been recognized for that. So I'm going to mute my microphone and I'm going to hand over to Donald. And if you wouldn't mind just giving us a brief background on yourself, Donald, I'll start to wade in with some questions once you're finished.
Sure, thanks, Craig. Well, my background on myself, I suppose, I've been around for a long time in this business. That's 33 years, I think. And you said a very interesting thing there about space practice, because actually space practice is a very old thing and goes back to 1885 when Ebbinghaus published this text in German. It was some time before it was published in English, I think 1906 or so. But space practice as a topic has been around there for about 130 years. And the odd thing about this principle in learning is that it's perhaps been researched to death. We know it works. We know it works in terms of quite significant increases in productivity in terms of recall and retention. And yet it's probably the most ignored single principle in learning theory. Lots of good theories ignored, I think, in teaching and so on. But that one above all has been literally abandoned, ignored, shoved under the carpet. But there are some very good reasons for this. And I just want to touch on them before we start and react very much by people's questions at me. I've got some PowerPoints, but I'll just go to them in response to the questions. But let me touch on one point here. Why is space practice almost never used? I think, well, one of the basic ones is really the learning world, whether it's teachers in schools, in higher education or in corporate, it's not a research-rich world. Hardly anyone has actually heard of Ebbinghaus, and many, in my experience, have never even heard of the phrase space practice, which always astonishes me. But secondly, even those who know find it difficult, because one, there's an obsession with courses, and the course is a course. It has a start point and end point. The other is an obsession with classrooms, so you go in and out the door, and they're fixed entities. And of course, when you walk out the door or the lecture hall, historically, we've never been able to get to learners. Now we have mobile phones. We have this umbilical cord that I keep saying, phones are no longer tethered to the wall like a goat. So we do have the ability to get to learners. That's one of the big changes here. But even now, I think the obsession with courses, even within the context of blended learning that was supposed to open this up, I can't think of any examples where I've seen space practice as part of an optimal blend. I think people just simply ignore it. And blended learning isn't really blended learning, it's blended teaching. They dice the things they know and ignore the things they don't know. So I think in many ways it is a fantastic topic, this, because I really do believe still that it gives us great hope for increasing productivity in learning. But it's not easy to implement, and hopefully we can get into some details on implementation tonight. I've spent many years studying the topic, and I'm practicing it on myself. I'm one of those people who do things just before I go to sleep, try them out myself, give myself self-tests and so on. But I've also implemented it and designed it in a full-scale product called Encore for Learning Pool. That's in the corporate market. And more recently been applying it with AI-driven algorithms in my own product called Wildfire. So, you know, it's not just the theory. I've been doing this in anger as well. But any questions to kick us off, Craig? Shoot one at me.
I have. Here we go. In fact, whilst I'm getting this, if you want to share your screen on, because I know you've got some visuals, I think that will help to get your point across. If you want to go through that process.
Yeah. As usual, we tried this today and rehearsed it, and it looks much better. My share screen is not coming up, but let's. How odd.
Let me fire the question.
Okay, do so.
I've heard about space learning for several years now, for 3, 4, 5 years. But I see the word spaced being used a lot, but I also see other words being used around it. I see spaced learning. I see spaced repetition, spaced practice, spaced testing. And part of me wonders, are they all the same thing? And we're just falling into that habit of substituting words here and there for personal preference. Or actually, is there an important difference between them? And if there is, what is that difference? Spaced learning, spaced practice, spaced repetition, spaced testing. What's it all about?
Okay, well, you're absolutely right to distinguish these things, because there is one major problem, and that is which many people have the idea that spaced practice is spaced repetition, which is not. So spaced repetition, the simple repetition of something, has a marginal impact in terms of retention and recall, or a different set of dynamics with regard to motor skills, depends on the type of learning, or recognition of faces and so on. But certainly just repeating something has a moderate effect. But spaced practice is something different, because we had a dose of Anders Ericsson in here, the guy who really came up with the whole notion of deliberate practice, marginal improvement, working to always improve as you go forward. And that's slightly different, I think. So just the repetition of something is one thing. So if we start with mass practice, we know that mass practice, just repeating something repeatedly, doesn't really give you much. Very marginal, but not much increase in retention. Spacing, the word space really matters, because lots of practice works, but only if it's spaced. The spacing thing really does give you a significant increase in bonus or dividend, okay? Because you're loading stuff from long-term memory and you're giving the brain time to consolidate in between. So it's not spaced repetition, which is repetition, it's spaced practice. That's a terribly important distinction here. And then we should add in deliberate practice, because that's almost a layer that one can put on top. It's all very well doing practice, but that begs the question, what type of practice? And there we have some really good evidence that, for example, multiple choice questions are pretty weak retention terms, open input's much better. And by and large, everything we've learned over the last 10 to 15 years in cognitive science is that effort matters. So the practice has to be testing, but really pulling stuff from the back of your brain. You're really having to recall things. Don't look at notes, highlight with highlight pens. Look away from your notes and try and recall in your brain. That's what really matters. And interestingly, that looking away, recalling things into your brain, not only that's the big consolidation event. It's really quite counterintuitive here, but the fact that you're recalling something strengthens it in memory as an act in itself, with even greater effect than the original teaching event where you first heard of that concept. So the act of recalling things effortfully really matters. Did I unpack it a bit?
It did. So if I was to give an example that might not appeal to everybody that's here today, but it's a kind of an L&D example. Spaced repetition. Let's look at some Salesforce people. Let's look at salespeople. Spaced repetition. Getting them to revisit and repeat facts, figures, product specifications, features, things like that, with spacing in between would be spaced repetition. Spaced practice would be getting them to apply those features, facts, product specifications in a sales type environment, perhaps in a simulation. So they're having to take the facts and figures, the raw data, and actually apply it to something that they're expected to do in the real world. Would that be an example of a real world example of spaced practice or spaced repetition leading on to spaced practice?
Yes, but funnily enough, the research suggests, and the two guys who wrote the book Make It Stick are interesting on this very point. And I've been involved with training of sales reps using wildfire and spaced practice. Now, the interesting point here is they don't have to go to very high cognitive application skills on the spaced practice. All they have to do is recall the terms, and then we've been getting them just to type the terms in a context. And funnily enough, you don't even have to type the whole word in. If you don't know what the term, let's say you're reading a medical paper and you have to know that medical paper, because if you go in and meet a clinician, they will eviscerate you if you don't know that fact. And if you don't know what hypertrophy is, for example, then you don't actually have to type the whole word hypertrophy in. You need only type a few letters of the word to get the effect of the recall. So it's not a massive amount of intellectual effort you have to apply on spaced practice sometimes, but it's effortful. And so they did various tests on what you have to do on spaced practice, as Roediger and McDaniel, and found that actually just typing in a couple of the vowels in a word was almost the same as typing in the whole word. But the fact is you had recalled the whole word in your memory, but then you had the act of typing it in, which is also a reinforcement event. So you don't have to do a lot, but it does have to be spaced. And another interesting piece of evidence is that there's some evidence to suggest that you should interleave it with other subjects as well. In other words, don't just do spaced practice on one thing, interleave your test items. That's interesting, I think. And it's all to do with the space. What happens when between events? And what happens there is consolidation. That's why spaced practice and the research on sleep is really fascinating, because we're being pushed towards finding that the optimum point for a bit of practice is just before you go to sleep. It's not during the working day at all. Because then you're recalling the stuff. That's a reinforcement event. You may even be typing it in. But when you go to sleep, you get this act of consolidation in the brain. And so the concept is starting to be finessed now. I think that's the important thing. And of course, I think an interesting follow-on from this is, I think almost everybody I've ever known who's smart and learns a lot knows this instinctively. And they do spaced practice without calling it spaced practice, but they do it anyway. Almost all the really smart consultants I've known always have a notebook. They're always taking notes endlessly. And when I look out into an audience in a conference, especially learning conferences, I'm astonished that people don't take notes, because we know that it's 20 to 30% increase in retention if you do it, if you start taking notes. But I've talked to thousands and thousands of people, and we're hundreds in the audience. I know with absolute certainty that they're not there to learn much, because they're not taking notes, they're not tweeting. Brings us to social media. We've discussed this before. Social media is essentially a form of spaced practice. If you tweet, Facebook, post, especially if you blog and consolidate your memories that way, and then people comment on the blog, that sort of long tail of social media activity, tweeting during a conference, afterwards, having a look at tweets, people retweeting, you reading them, they're all forms of spaced practice. And I think, most people who learn a lot and read a lot, underline books, all sorts of things, they do spaced practice without thinking.
Something you mentioned a few minutes ago, Donald, you mentioned about consolidating and research showing that doing something before you go to sleep in that period of time before that is useful. You and I spoke earlier on. It was quite fascinating to hear you talk about, yes, there's the science, there's the research, there's the data, there's the facts. But what about convenience? And it seemed to be that you were suggesting that actually convenience trumps the science. Now, I was putting words in your mouth there because you didn't actually say that. That's what I interpreted it as.
Yeah.
It's about this science versus convenience.
No, this is very interesting, because it's a bit like the problem doctors have with young patients and drugs. You can recommend a regime for a young child to take a diabetes treatment, insulin and so on. But compliance is a bigger problem. In other words, getting that teenager to do it is a bigger problem than the patterns sometimes, or exactly when you take and so on. And we have a same.
We can see your slides now. Sorry for interrupting.
Great. No problem. Yeah. In fact, I think I've got that convenience thing down here somewhere. Yeah. So you could, like, there are certain things from the science of learning that one would take into consideration when designing space practice. Chunking the material down, that's important. Cognitive overload. We know about working memory, long-term memory, memory type, semantic, episodic. There's all that theory. There's loads of it. But when it comes to designing, and this happened when I was involved with designing a thing called Encore for Learning Pool, what's more important is that people actually do it. Now, there's a big difference between a commuter who's driving, let's say a salesperson who's driving to work every morning at 7:30. Hey, that's a great time to do some space practice learning Spanish in your car. If you're a mother of 2 young kids and you're giving them space practice at 6:30 p.m., you're on a hiding to nothing, because they're going to be feeding their kids and putting them to bed and so on. So I think there's something to be said for almost, and we've been playing around with this a little bit. Do you allow the learners themselves to give them a calendar, a start date and end date? Let's say the end date is when you sit the exam. Start date's now.
On the slide, because what we're seeing is the 50 learning theorists.
All right. Okay. Yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah. The convenience thing is, that's Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve, which is a power curve, so it's squared. So that descends really quickly. You forget stuff really quickly. And we know that from conferences. You know, you can ask people at lunchtime and they can barely remember the first speaker that morning. To counter that descent, you have to do rapid reinforcement here at the beginning, and then you can lay off in a space practice. That's generally true. But out here, the spacing doesn't have to be too exact. What's more important is that the people do it, so that you allow the learner to choose when and at what periodicity and at what time is most convenient for them. Because ultimately doing it is better than not doing it. And you find if you have these fixed periods and it always goes out at 2:30 on a Tuesday afternoon, most people just fall off the end because they're doing other things. So, and it's also true of the frequency. You can sometimes allow people to choose the frequency. So here, it's definitely true scientifically. The research shows that you should be doing stuff here at the beginning quite quickly, 1 hour, a couple of hours afterwards, maybe the next day. But then you could play a bit faster loose out here a little bit. And that's what I mean by, yeah, you're absolutely right there. Convenience does matter. Hello?
Sorry, I've muted myself. Schoolboy error.
Okay.
Many of us that are on this call are in some way, shape or form responsible for developing other people as part of our jobs. We're L&D managers, consultants, that type of thing.
Yeah.
What is there that's out there that we / our organisations may already have, probably do have, that we can tap into to create this space? In fact, perhaps things that we've never thought about using in that way.
Okay.
And also, I'm also conscious that what is there that our end users might have, probably do have, that we could also tap into? So I guess the question is, we're L&D professionals, what is there that we can tap into, first of all, that we've probably already got to better enable this spacing effect? Good
question. It's easy to talk about this stuff. It's more difficult to implement it in institutions and organizations. I think let's start at the bottom of the ladder then, Craig, because I think the first thing is email. I don't know many organizations or many people who don't have an email address. And there are various tools you can use with email to institute and implement very simple space practice. And the great thing about email is you can have attachments, you can have links within the emails back to a portion of the course. Within the email, you can have summarizing events, pieces of video, questions, you can have HTML in there. So I think the first rung of the ladder is, without any cost at all, any extra tech, you can just, whatever learning experience you're delivering out there, include that little bit of post-course, post-classroom, post-online email follow-up. That's true probably of texting as well. So I think that's easy. The next level up is one on here called Anki, because there's stuff out there that's free, and that's an open source thing that I think we've discussed in one of these Hangouts before. My son uses Anki, and he's doing a sort of computer science degree. His mates use it, and that because Anki is a sort of flashcard system, but it has inbuilt algorithms which produce personalized spaced learning. So if you get together and use Anki and construct questions and answers, and then you start giving your confidence ratings on the answers and so on, it will, over time, work for you. And that's absolutely free. It's open source. It could be a bit buggy at times, but it's okay. So there's a free one, okay? Then there's, if you're coming up the ladder, of course, then there's the light touch, like Encore from Learning Pool, which is built on the back of their library. So they're a big content provider in the public sector. And Encore takes stuff from the course and delivers it across time. Ranks is, another one. Ranks and Drillster are very similar. Cerego's sort of more adaptive learning, higher education team, but that definitely has quite sophisticated space practice built into it. And QStream's a hardcore train the salespeople, get that medical paper into the heads of the people who are selling a drug for a pharmaceutical company. So we have a ladder right at the bottom, really easy stuff with email and texting and other forms of messaging if you wish. You may have Yammer, all sorts of things within your organization. Up in open source through Anki, and there are other versions, other types, open source things like Anki, and then out into paid services. And in Wildfire as well, I'm not going to do a sales pitch for you, but that's also something that we're offering there as well. Did that make sense?
Yes, it does indeed, and don't be shy of mentioning Wildfire. It's not been shortlisted for no good reason, and the demos that you've shown me of it, and certainly the feedback that we got in the artificial intelligence level was incredibly positive. So if you've got time and you want to come back and have a look at that, I'd be very happy to spend some time taking it, give it some more well-deserved airtime. So we've things that we can use as L&D practitioners that we might be able to tap into and offer to our audience. We've looked at things that they might have, because of course, if we can tap into SMS, we're hoping they've got a way of receiving it. If they're tapping into email, they've probably got a way of receiving it.
Yeah.
What about for us individually? I often think that as L&D practitioners, I think commendably, spend a lot of time worrying about how do we develop others? How can we better support others? But what about ourselves? What sort of tools, tips, techniques have you come across? It's a loaded question because I know you've got some good ideas.
Right. Yeah.
So, of course, if we're better developed as L&D practitioners, if we're better versed, if we're better educated, if we're better informed, that can only be a good thing for the people that rely on us. So, flipping it on its head, how do we look after ourselves with space repetition, space learning?
Okay. Well, I think for people in L&D or teachers in schools and so on, I think there's one book I like to recommend to people, and that's this Make It Stick thing, because it's readable and it really summarizes the last 12 years or so of cognitive science, and it has a fair bit of good stuff on space practice, along with all these other things. And what's quite interesting about this book is if you read it very carefully, it knocks on the head some more traditional forms of e-learning. I've been blogging a lot about this recently, but it sort of says that, the sort of learning we see with lots of like Pavlovian gamification and animation and cartoons and buzz may actually end up inhibiting learning. So these guys are saying go for open response question because you have to make the effort. They're all about effortful learning, not choosing lists from multiple choice questions. Nobody in the real world ever works from little lists when they're trying to apply a skill or recall knowledge. It's not how the brain works. And in fact, multiple choice questions may, because it provides distractors, the distractors themselves may be the things you remember better than the right answer. So forcing recall, regular testing, open response, personalization, delayed feedback. And loads of systems, you get the feedback, boom, you answer a question, boom, big time feedback. That may not be the best idea because you haven't had time to consolidate what you're learning. And then, of course, space practice. So that's the first thing, it's almost CPD there. I think the second thing, and then a more light touch book for people in L&D, if you've got a big team and you want people to get to grips with the whole concept of space practice and deliberate practice, highly recommend Matthew Syed's book, Paperback Bounds. Very readable book about why practice matters in learning. But I think, I'm going to be a bit personal here because this is just the journey I took. I think another thing is just knowing what the theory is. That's one thing, but actually doing it. And I think within L&D departments, just the massive recommendation that people should be taking notes. And if you're walking into a room, and I've heard this in lecture halls and universities, and people say, yeah, I want you to listen to me for an hour and don't take any notes. That's a stupid thing to say, because there is some payoff if you miss something while you're taking notes, but it's a massive, let me get to that slide just so you know what it is. We're really talking about written notes increasing learning by about 20 to 30%, especially if you use analogies, summaries, your own words, draw little diagrams and so on. So we're talking about huge productivity increases here. A second thing that people should be encouraged to do, and I've always loved this book by Marc Augé, a French philosopher, called Non-Places. And John Locke talked about this, William James talked about it a lot, habitual learning, what I call H learning. I think to get away from the course mindset and the classroom and even the online learning mindset, the notion that learning is encouraged through the development of good habits is a really important thing. And I'm in the habit of, I don't drive, so I take trains a lot. I'm in the habit of opening my laptop and always having a book on the train. And I've done it all my life because it's just habit for me. So that's important. Just before you go to sleep, this whole notion here. So there's certain habits I think that are important for people to pick up on here.
Share with us what we've spoken about a few times in the pub around the geological history and kings and queens and just how you've
all right, okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, this is for my own gratification, really. But when I'm testing myself, I give myself a challenge, and so I could tell you all the usual. This is lists, so it's not applicable to all forms of learning. But after a while, you get really, really good. I could tell you every king and queen of England, every pharaoh in Egypt, every Roman emperor, all the pre-Socratics, every president of the United States, all the geological epochs, all that stuff. And it doesn't take much. And you know what really helped me a lot here? I used to teach maths to young kids, young boys who were really thought they were bad at maths. They weren't really. And I used to say, do you know the kings and queens of England? And they would say, well, actually, no, none of them knew it. I said, well, I'll tell you, within 10 to 15 minutes, you'll know all 41 of them. And not one of those kids ever believed it was possible, but it is if you use little simple memory techniques. And it always amazed them. And it always got me off in a good sort of start with them because they were astonished at what their own brains could do. And it's astonished me personally. So I regularly give myself these challenges. And they're not that sort of memory test, like remembering packs of cards or whatever. You could pick that up, and there's some very good books on that, and some good techniques as well. But I think just practicing it yourself to see how powerful this damn thing is really important for people who are in this game. And then a second thing is to reflect on the whole notion of social media and how that can be used for space practice with yourself. I'm very conscious when I use Twitter and blog and so on that I'm practicing all these things on the right-hand side here. And these are, and a blog piece I wrote, these are things that you do if you use social media. It makes you reflect. You have to generate content. You have to elaborate on that content if you want to make it clickable for other people. Twitter's typical. You retrieve the content by going back and looking at what's been retweeted. Quite often interleave and vary things. If you're at a conference, you won't just tweet on one topic. You'll tweet on a number of different things. You space it out on social media. You may tweet one day and get people retweeting days, even weeks later. Use imagery if you're posting stuff onto social media, which is great. You archive the stuff so it's there. And you get into the habit of learning and recalling stuff, writing tweets. That's a form of habitual learning for me. And then there's a whole social thing because you're in touch with other groups. So here's 10 things that are all great attributes of space learning and after course or after classroom events that really do work. And we actually do them without thinking when we use these things, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Blogger, messaging, WhatsApp, you name it, which is, so, my experience is, and it's great when you're watching television and you actually know this stuff, because you've lodged it there in your brain. It's still there months afterwards because it's been very successfully shunted from working memory to long-term memory.
Donald, we've just passed the half hour, so we've been going probably about 30 minutes if you take away my blurb at the beginning. So I just wanted to offer up an opportunity for anybody else to jump in, either in the chat panel. Remember, that's on the right-hand side of your screen. If you can't see it, activate it on the left-hand side of your screen. Or anybody wants to open their mic up and follow the question that way. So just sure. And if nothing appears in that chat panel and no mic becomes active, I guess we'll crack on.
Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Nothing's appearing, but if a chat does appear, I'll
okay.
Something that Rachel said, 1926.
Yeah.
Rachel talking about email making sense, and she fancies exploring and making more use of it. Now I know that Rachel's is in the MOOC, so I did kind of wanted to share one of my probably quite obvious observations, but I think it's worth saying out loud. Every week throughout this MOOC, I've sent out a nudge email, a reminder, something to hook people to come back in. And we've been rotating it. So this week was a Monday, next week Tuesday, and we're going to do that throughout the entire year to see if the day of the week influences replies. What I can say to Rachel and anybody else that's listening is there is, unsurprisingly, a hell of a spike the day I send the email out and the day after. The rest of the week it trots along nicely. There's activity, people are logging in, people are commenting, brilliant. That email goes out, and remember, apparently we all hate emails and we all get too many emails and we're all trying to find ways of getting less emails. But you know what? That email I send out once a week, boom, the spike just is crazy for 24, 48 hours afterwards. Then it goes back to normal again. So for anybody, thinking about tapping into that email thing and wondering, oh, is it another email? Is anybody going to respond to it? My experience is people respond to it. People do something with it. They click on it, they go back into the course, and it triggers them to revisit, to interweave, to reconsider. All of the things that you mentioned, many of the things you mentioned, that social media list, it promotes that. So that's, so thank you for mentioning that, Rachel. Brilliant. Let me stop you in your tracks a little, Donald, and pose a challenge to you.
Okay.
We talked about emails, text messages. We talked about using social media and all of various on short form and long form and things like that. One of the things that I've noticed, particularly this month in the MOOC, but there has been a trend of it throughout the other 8 months of the MOOC, is people really like an idea. They love a concept. It makes sense to them. But we can't use text messaging because we don't issue company phones and we can't intrude on people's own phones. We'd love to do this, but unfortunately, we're not allowed to have a Twitter account, so we can't tweet things from our L&D team. We'd love to do that, but unfortunately we can't because not everybody. So I kind of get the feeling that there's loads of people out there really keen to try something different, but there's a factor, and I'm not poo-pooing that it's a small factor, but there's a factor that's stopping them because they can't do it for everybody. So it's safer, is it, to do it for nobody than risk somebody saying you're not being inclusive? What are your thoughts on this? And it's not necessarily about space learning, this, of course. This could be a much broader thing, but keeping it narrowed down to this challenge of using different tools to affect spacing. What are your thoughts?
Well, it's a line off news here, but I really don't like the idea that inclusion becomes a destructive, disastrous neutron bomb for destroying learning. So that the line I always have here is I grew up in a house without any books in Scotland. We didn't have any books in my house. My parents were working class people, but I never remember anybody in the learning world saying Donald doesn't have any books at home, let's not use books for learning. But when it comes to technology, this pops up all the time because of the digital divide, the inclusion debate and so on. And there is something to that. I don't want to poo-poo that or deny it. But we can't continually just destroy everything because a couple of people don't have access to something. Nevertheless, I think where there's a will, there's a way. And in most organizations, this is especially true of compliance. I can't tell you how often, in fact, this week, I was in a pharmaceutical company where people were telling me that the regulators forced them to do these multiple choice tests in compliance. And that's just simply not true. The regulators don't tell anybody to make really awful learning courses. No regulator does that. They may mandate training, but that's different. So you're hardly ever under the pressure to produce some of the things we do rather badly, I think, in the online learning world, certainly. But I think the examples I've given you there, from within an organization, email, I can't imagine anybody restricting too much your ability to communicate with your learners by email. So I think it's this where there's a will, there's a way notion. And of course, from email, you can link to all sorts of things. There may be firewall issues about, access to YouTube and all sorts of things. But within whatever envelope you got, I think there's always an opportunity for space practice, even if it's just promoting space practice as good practice. As I say, note-taking, habitual learning, being aware of some of the basic things as a learner that you should know about this theory, that it really does work, that mass practice doesn't work, the spacing helps consolidate memory. Those simple messages getting out to everyone would help enormously. But yeah.
There's something that Rachel said about starting with a small group. When I used to work at Bupa, we had a product launch for a sales and service support type people, brand new type of thing. We took, unsurprisingly, it was a very different way of delivering it. And one of those was using a tool that's no longer around now called Retender to drip feed via mail, via text messages, or via a physical postcard arriving on their desk through the mail.
Yeah.
These reminders. We opted for the SMS because it was different enough, but it was cheaper as well than the postcard. It was accessible enough. So we opted for the SMS, and the whole cohort of people, nobody actually had a company-issued mobile phone. They were all their own personal devices. So we offered this opportunity for them. Less than a third of people, less than maybe 15, 20% of people opted for it. So we entered their numbers into the system and they started to get these drip feeds. A funny old thing, without any more pushing or prodding from us, other people came along and said, actually, I do want to sign up. Yeah, go on now. Because I think they'd seen their peers using it. Their peers were starting to improve. Something happened that wasn't necessarily as repeated stick waving from us. This cohort, this interest grew. So if we'd opted for only the minority want it, we won't do it, we never got to the stage where there was probably around 50% of the cohort that ended up opting into text messages. So I completely agree with what Rachel said there, and what you said, Donald, about not dropping the idea completely just because the masses aren't on board with it.
Well, that's absolutely right, and a lot of the answers to these problems are really marketing issues. And there's a very famous example by Ernst & Young when there was a training program around phishing. I mean, phishing with PH, phishing emails for false procurement. You get invoices and so on. And what they did was the training had failed miserably, standard classroom training, and people were still making mistakes and responding and giving information out phishing emails. So what they did was they sent, and the training department constructed a phishing email and sent it out to people, and then started picking up on the people who were fooled into responding to it. And it so shocked people that everybody in the company heard about this, and they were always expecting the phishing email from the training department, and everybody followed up with a follow-up type training, which was reinforcement training. Now, I think that's a good example of brilliant marketing by a brilliant training department. Smart stuff. But I think that's what we have to do with spaced learning as well. To get people, you've got to kickstart habits and keep them going. And that's a really tough thing. It's really easy to rock up to a training classroom and do a course. That's the simplest thing in the world, just to turn up. The difficult thing is to learn and consolidate your learning. And that's why the individual has to take some responsibility for this. That's why getting them to choose the pattern, their convenience pattern, for example, how they might want to receive it. Do you just want to do the course a little bit of the test again? Or do you just want a reinforcement in terms of a simple summary? Or do you really want to have to make the effort and we really test you hardcore? That sort of stuff really matters. But a lot of this is to do with marketing.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Donald. I've got a question from Ben, which is followed up by Rachel. Ben's saying, are we at risk of making folks believe that they only need spaced learning for information that they should be retaining in a rote fashion? Kings, queens, pharaohs, product specifications, things like that.
Oh no, yeah. I mean,
We tend to see it as an thinks people
yeah,
need specific information rather than necessarily a behaviour.
yeah,
Weaving it into normal practice. And Rachel's kind of backed that up, saying,
yeah.
can we use it for developing skills and behaviours rather than the rote information that might be demonstrated within those behaviours?
Well, there is a danger if that's all that's talked about. I mean, I was giving my personal experience there, and it was a bit misleading. But and what you have to be a bit careful here, because spaced practice doesn't work in exactly the same way for different types of learning. So with motor skills, for example, I mean, spaced practice is clearly a big deal in motor skills. Nobody learns how to play golf just by playing golf. You know, you have to practice at playing golf, and deliberate practice really matters over time. Often, so spaced practice is generally true for all learning, but it applies in different ways. So even for the more sophisticated stuff, nobody is telling me, you know, I just despise those leadership programs where managers rock up to some classroom, they're given this hopelessly utopian view about good practice and be authentic and blah, blah, blah. And then they walk out in some utopian world where it's all going to work. That's just the beginning of the journey. No manager ever learns how to be a good manager from one of those classroom courses. They learn by raw experience and over time and making mistakes. And that's a form of spaced practice if they keep applying the good skills that they should have as managers. One of the reasons I don't like the more abstract leadership training. But if I give you an example, there's Duolingo. Now that number there is up to about 150, probably getting on for 170 million now. And these people are learning a language, which is one of the hardest things you'll ever do in your life. And sure, lots of people drop off, but if you've used Duolingo, which is an algorithm-driven spaced practice approach, personalized to you as a language learner, you will find it's pretty smart. And if you don't use it for a week, it dials you back and makes you do stuff that it knows you've forgotten. So for more sophisticated skills like learning a language, management skills, motor skills, we know that practice matters. We know that spaced practice matters as well. So if you read Matthew Syed's book, one I recommended earlier, the great thing about that book is that's nothing to do with basic knowledge. Matthew Syed himself was a table tennis player. And the interesting thing about his story, of course, is that the top 5 best table tennis players in the UK all came from the same 2 or 3 streets where he lived, because they had a club that was open 24 hours, everybody had a key, great coaches, and they did a massive amount of practice. Deliberate practice, in fact, straight out Anders Ericsson. So it doesn't matter what the type of learning is, this stuff can be applied. I think another very interesting lesson here, I'll show you this slide here as well. One of the reasons we talked about using email and so on, but there's another thing that's hit the streets now, and it's already been there. I think spaced practice has been one of the areas where artificial intelligence has been used to good effect for some time. And let me explain why. You can go and find algorithms on spaced practice on Wikipedia. Some of them are Poland, some of them are open source, some of them you can buy. In other words, if the computer's deciding what the spacing is and what you're going to receive over what period of time for you as an individual, that has to be done by maths. And there's some very, very clever algorithms that decide what the spacing is going to be for you as an individual. That's how Duolingo works. But AI is going to the next level on this stuff as well, because it may actually learn about your behavior post-course. So as you're doing your spaced practice, this stuff is an opportunity to gather evidence about what's most convenient for you, for example, in spaced practice. How long do you spend? You know, all sorts of behavioral traits, as well as the feedback it gets when you do short tests. And of course, we know that actually, funnily enough, AI works through massive reinforcement. Well, one portion of AI works through reinforcement. That's a big thing in machine learning now. But I think we're seeing AI come to play here. That's what lies behind Duolingo. So, you know, when you get spaced practice in Duolingo, it's for you. It's absolutely unique because there's some very smart maths behind the thing. And that's increasingly the case with all those other tools I mentioned there. You know, things like ranks and so on. And to give you some idea how sophisticated this is now getting, it's not just interleaving. So things you know, nearly know, and unknown. And then of course, you've got to reinforce all 3 in spaced practice. You can't just assume you'll know it because you're going to forget it. But we also have things like hopping techniques. Sorego use this. to easy, medium, difficult ones. It's quite a sophisticated technique, all built into the maths. And then this notion that if you miss, supposing you go away and miss a week's worth of learning German on Duolingo, and you come back, the system knows you've missed a week, takes it and spreads it like jam over the subsequent week. So there's a lot of smart maths behind how spaced learning can be delivered. And I think this is where this stuff will go. So some of the companies I mentioned here, Ranks, Drillster, and so on, they're using quite smart algorithms and QStream. They're and Answer Regular. They're all using quite smart algorithms to deliver the spaced learning itself.
Going back to Ben's question, thank you, Donald, about, I mean, I've been involved with a client recently from an automotive sales, car sales.
Yeah.
So yeah, they need to know data, they need to know information, they need to know facts and figures. They also need to be able to communicate that in a very friendly, non-confrontational, non-pushy, but reassuring way to other human beings.
Yes.
Well, in terms of spaced learning for that type of environment, are we looking at things like simulations that then tap into what it is that you've done or not done and feed that back to you, rather than the fact that you got this fact wrong, you got this figure correct, and so I'll feed this to you again, but I won't feed it. Are we looking at more simulations? Are we looking at more at real world observations from managers, from CRM systems, from mystery shoppers that feed back into this kind of machine learning loop to know that Craig may or may not know the facts and figures, but when he came to sell me this car, because I'm a mystery shopper, he demonstrated these behaviors really well. I didn't see these behaviors at all, and these behaviors were actually very poor, all going back into some sort of central feedback system to give my manager feedback, to give me feedback, or to start to drip feed things back to me around those poorly demonstrated behaviors. Is that how we can see a real world vocational physical representation of a behavior or a motor skill feeding into this spaced learning ecosystem, for want of a better phrase?
Yeah, I was looking around for something. I think there's a really good example of this, which is, and I can't tell you the name of the bank for confidentiality reasons, but it's a global bank that got hit by a $1 billion fine last year. And they're using simulation type stuff in a loop. So people all over the world do their training in a 3D simulated environment, game-like environment, but not with all the sort of chasing coins, rubies, and all that sort of thing. You know, hardcore training, how to give out loans and assess risk on loans. And then they use the training itself. They look for behaviors in the trainees to see what's gone wrong, and then the AI, they put it through an analytics engine and find out what the insights are from that. And from those insights, they feed it back into the training to adjust the training, but they also make process changes in the organization. So the simulation is like a living experiment within the organization. It's the most amazing piece of e-learning I've ever seen, because they spent, I mean, several $1 million on this, but the original insights were counterintuitive, and therefore when you get and find $1 billion, a few $1 million is less than the coffee money, so it makes sense in that. And I think increasingly we'll see AI act in this fashion with training. And space practice is a good example here. If space practice starts to work and you're already getting data from the salespeople about the causality between the training and the increase in sales from each individual salesperson, then we're really getting somewhere in terms of making training absolutely relevant for that organization. And we can do that now. So people like QStream promise that. They don't often link up right directly to the sales side, but that's coming. So once you've got good data gathering within an organization, you can close the loop and see that whole level 4 impact of training on whatever you're going to measure. And then it's a virtuous loop. You come back, and even within that, the AI may be correcting, looking for weaknesses in the course, improving it all the time, so you get into a virtuous circle.
I love what you said then around the process changes. I guess we often consider that if something's going wrong,
yeah,
that the person's at fault, the person's broken, that the mechanism for developing that person is broken, and focusing all our efforts on that, when actually, you know, it might be the environment. You know, there are several things that impact performance. You know, training is one, but there's motivation, there's the environment that people are in, so that there's the systems and tools that they have to work with. So I love the fact that it wasn't just thinking throw more shit at Craig, maybe we need to look outside of Craig and across it, because it may be the process that's at fault. I love the sound of that.
Yeah.
And also, I just wanted to, there's a few people nodding and a few people commenting in the chat then. Okay. Just wanted to go for anybody that after today, some point in the future, if you ever wanted to look at how we're using XAPI, the Experience API, to be able to, yes, gather data around what people are doing in this training and development part of their life, but also actually how we can use XAPI to be able to look at what they're doing back, what I call in the real world, on the sales floor, on the shop floor, in the real environment, and be able to look at the correlation between the two. Feel free to drop me a line from tomorrow onwards, and we'll hook something up. It was just you mentioning that correlation between learning and performance and being able to detect causalities. It kind of prompted me to just offer that out to people.
And there is another angle to this as well, which people are forgetting. But in MOOC land, the world you're in now, we had that early example from Coursera where a couple of thousand kids got an algebra question wrong in a maths course. And of course, it gets caught because you got the data to show that that was a statistical spike. And it was just a bad question. Now, there was a thing called Hegarty Maths, which is used in loads of British schools. And the guy who writes the questions there sometimes writes quite oddball questions, which are bait and switch questions. And it was the baits the kid gets it wrong and goes, aha, you got it wrong. And I just completely disagree with that way of teaching. But sometimes he just designs bad questions. And he's a good guy. We're regular correspondents. He quite likes it being pointed out. But the systems now can autocorrect the training programs. And I think that's important because most trainers and teachers I know fall into a pattern of delivering set scripts. I do it myself. We all do it. It's what Roger Schrank identified in study all those years ago. And some of those scripts are a bit faulty and not very good. So the notion of continuous improvement on the delivery of a course as a teacher or in online learning doesn't really exist. We build the online learning, we launch it, and it stays the same. It's a fossil. But with AI and various other reflective techniques, I think we have the opportunity of identifying things that are wrong in courses, not only processes, and autocorrecting them or certainly correcting them. We don't do nearly enough of that.
Let me come towards the last 5 minutes. I'm gonna kind of come out with a double barrel task, but it's not all on you, Donald. It's not all on you. I'm gonna be a bit cheesy first of all. I'm gonna say to people, if you wouldn't mind putting into the chat panel, what's your Thursday morning quick win from this conversation we've just had with Donald? What's the thing that he said, suggested, tooled, whatever it is? What's kind of brought that light bulb on above your head where you thought, I'm going to go and have this conversation, try this, download that? If you could just drop that into the chat panel, because I'm sure we'd all be interested in seeing, just what's resonated with people. The flip side of that coin is I'm going to get Donald to answer this. You started to answer this at the beginning, but I know you've got a slide that touches on this. We know that spaced learning is well researched, it's well proven, it works because we all do it. Why then, once you step into the work at 9 o'clock in the morning and put your corporate hat on, why is there so little damn usage of it? Why is there so little engineered usage? Because it still happens, but why is there so little engineered usage of it? And I know you've got a slide to outline this. So if people are dropping that, thank you, Bob and Kate, for doing that into the chat panel. Donald, if you wouldn't mind answering, why is it not happening then?
Yeah, just the reason I think it's not happening is it's always couched as learning, and people think that learning, because they've been told it is at school, at college, and by training departments, people equate learning with turning up, walking through the door in a room, and being talked at. And that was true in school, university, through lectures and college, and also true of corporate training a lot of the time. So anything after the course, and this stuff seems a bit weird to them. That's not training. That's not learning. But maybe we shouldn't be branding it as learning, because hardly anybody ever learned how to use PowerPoint in a training course. But we learn through practice and spaced practice. Rather badly, it takes people a long time. Actually, what we need is some directed learning plus practice. But we have to. My solution to this is blended learning, and I think spaced practice should be a compulsory component in every blend. How's that for a bold statement? I don't think a blended learning course is a truly blended learning course unless it has coped or encourage space practice. That's a really good, almost mandate for blended learning, not blended teaching. I'm saying the reason I've never seen a blended learning course with space practice in it is they're all blended teaching courses. They just design teaching methods. It's just different delivery methods. If you really pay attention to learning, then you have to pay attention to practice and space practice, and you have to include it in your blend. So I would say, these reasons I've got up here are the reasons I'm not taking, I don't think the learning profession take it seriously. We're obsessed by classrooms and courses, but this make it compulsory in every blend would be a great mantra for L&D.
I was grinning from ear to ear when you said that, and I'm going to give a little sneak preview for the people that are on the MOOC. You may be able to see some post-it notes in the background that kind of look a little bit like an arrowhead. Coming up in November, December, you're going to be hit with a challenge, people on the MOOC, to design a program, a development program for whatever you want. You've got some optional factors that you can include in it, and you've got some mandatory factors. And funny old thing, one of the mandatory factors is spacing. So I'm pleased it gets Donald's vote of confidence. That'll be one of the things that you have to include in this factual or fictional development program you're going to put together using component parts from throughout the MOOC. So I'm pleased. If anyone's got any comeback on it, I'll just quote you, Donald. So looking back through, we've got what have we got? We've got. Could you repeat the philosopher's name? Kate's forgotten the name of the philosopher that you mentioned.
Well, the book I'm really recommending is by. I'm just putting it in now. Make it stick in chat by Rodinger and McDaniel. Okay, that has loads of stuff in space practice, along with loads of other brilliant stuff as well. The philosopher's name, the guy, wait, don't read his book because it's incomprehensible. It's about 700 pages as well. Ebbinghaus was 1885. Okay. Any other things? But I really recommend the Make It Stick book, because that gives you some good case studies in space practice, along with a very succinct and readable summary of some of the research, with some good citations in the back as well.
Let's have a look back through what people are going to talk about, and let's close this off this evening. Bob's going to look back over his notes. I like what you did there, Bob, and explore Anki, very meta. Kate's going to take a look at that book that you've just very kindly provided a bit more detail on. Nola's going to practice more note-taking and suggest to her team that they explore these post-course emails, these post-program emails. Ben says, it sounds like a ton of effort because of what we think learning is. Some thought and practice. Rachel's reflection is just how well researched space practice is. It's not an off-the-wall, fad, current, kind of fashionable thing to be thinking about. Bob said it's not taught in the trainer sessions. I don't know if you're responsible for developing or managing those, Bob, or sourcing those, but no, I don't think it is. I've been on a few in the military, and one since I came out. They were all crap compared to what I now know, but no, it was never mentioned. You're right. Janet there is backing up Mark. McDaniel doing some fabulous work, so she's pleased that you've referenced that. Oh, Ben wasn't answering because it was just Ben. It's your Hangout. Bitch away. Thanks. 700 isn't that long. Depends on the content, I guess. Yeah, you might change your mind once you've read it, Kate. Whatever you've dropped into there, brilliant. Thank you. I guess I was getting you to think back from what Donald said, recall things, drop them into there. I might screenshot that and send it to you in a day or two's time, maybe a week's time, just to see whether or not you ever got there. Final space for questions. You can drop them in there. I'm also super conscious it's 2 minutes past 8, so I've outstayed my welcome. What I want to say, like I always do, is a big thank you to everyone that's found an hour ways for you to come along to this. But an even bigger thanks to Donald. It's the second time he's done this for us. He's the most frequent Hangout attendee, apart from Janet, who's a very close second. Thank you ever so much, Donald. If you could drop your thanks into the chat panel there, that'd be really appreciated. And if for some bizarre reason you're not following Donald's blog, his Twitter channel. If you're not subscribing to what he says, I don't quite know why you wouldn't be. I suppose one of the biggest ways of saying thank you to him would be to go and do that now. Find him online, subscribe to him, follow him, and because there's more of the good stuff that he's spoken about in the past hour. He puts that out there regularly for free for people to benefit from. So that's a huge thanks to everybody that's logged into there. Another big thanks to yourself, Donald. I'm going to hang around until the last person leaves, and I'll turn the light off behind me. Feel free to close the browser down and make your way kindly out of the exits. No running, no pushing, and please don't leave behind any personal possessions. Thanks ever so much for your time, guys. Thank you very much as well, Donald.